Karoline Leavitt sat upright, her expression unwavering under the glare of the studio lights. American Perspectives Tonight had drawn millions of viewers, eager to witness the clash between her and Alan Brooks, a journalist known for his sharp, unfiltered questioning. The debate was supposed to be about leadership and policy, but the tension in the air suggested something deeper. Karoline had built her reputation on standing firm in her beliefs, never hesitating to challenge the mainstream. Alan, on the other hand, had a reputation for exposing weaknesses, pushing his guests into difficult territory with relentless questioning. For the first 20 minutes, the discussion followed the usual rhythm of political discourse, economic policies, legislative decisions. But everyone watching knew it was only a matter of time before the conversation shifted into something more intense, something that would test their convictions in ways no one expected. Karoline remained composed, answering each question with precision and clarity. She wasn't just a politician, she was a masterful communicator, someone who knew how to connect beyond the walls of the studio. But then, Alan shifted slightly in his chair, his expression tightening. A subtle movement, but one that signaled a change in direction. The atmosphere in the room shifted. Producers, cameramen, and audience members felt it. The debate was about to take a personal turn. Alan's voice was steady as he addressed her directly. He brought up her faith, questioning how it influenced her leadership and policy decisions. Karoline listened without reaction, waiting. Then he leaned forward, challenging her with a pointed remark about religion's decline, the rise of science, and the idea that faith no longer held the same universal truth. The audience murmured, sensing that the discussion had reached a critical moment, one that could redefine the entire conversation. Karoline didn't respond right away. She let the question settle, aware that Alan wasn't just challenging her beliefs, he was questioning the very relevance of faith itself. He continued, pushing the argument further, suggesting that faith was an outdated crutch, something that hindered progress rather than propelled it. The atmosphere in the studio grew heavier. People shifted, cameras zoomed in, capturing every micro-expression. Alan had ignited a fire, and everyone was waiting to see if Karoline would let it spread or extinguish it in a way no one expected. But she remained composed, taking a slow breath, tilting her head ever so slightly, a hint of a smile crossing her lips. She knew exactly what she was about to say. Alan leaned back, tapping his pen against the desk, watching. The audience held its breath. The silence wasn't awkward. It was charged with anticipation. Karoline let it linger a second longer before finally speaking, her voice unwavering. She repeated his words, letting them echo back at him, ready to turn the conversation in a direction no one had seen coming. Karoline held Alan's gaze, her expression calm but unwavering. She posed a question that cut through the debate, forcing everyone to consider something deeper. What happens when science doesn't have an answer? Alan's lips twitched, but he didn't interrupt. She continued, pointing out how easy it was to dismiss faith when life was predictable, when everything was in order, jobs secure, families healthy, the world making sense. But what about when life shattered? When a child was dying in a hospital bed? When someone stood at a gravesite hearing the final words over a closed casket? When doctors said there was nothing left to do? The studio fell into absolute silence. Even the producers, usually whispering behind the cameras, seemed frozen. Alan shifted slightly, adjusting his tie but didn't break eye contact. Then he counted. People turn to faith out of desperation, not because it's real, but because it's comforting. Karoline gave a small nod, almost as if she had expected that response. Her voice remained steady. Comfort, she said, was not a weakness. Karoline's voice remained steady as she spoke, making it clear that faith was more than just comfort. It was resilience, hope, and the belief that even in the darkest moments, life still had meaning. Some might call that naive, but she argued that it was the very thing that had kept people from breaking under the weight of suffering for centuries. Alan exhaled through his nose, shifting in his chair, his eyes studying her. Then he pressed further. Was she saying belief was necessary for survival? Karoline didn't hesitate. She wasn't just talking about survival, she was talking about what made survival worth something. A faint smile crossed Alan's lips as he shook his head, acknowledging her skill in debate. But then he changed direction. He brought up history, pointing out the wars, oppression, and corruption carried out by religious institutions. And yet, she still defended faith as if it had only been a force for good. But Karoline didn't flinch. Her expression didn't waver. She acknowledged that terrible things had been done in the name of faith, but that wasn't the whole story. Karoline didn't hesitate. While faith had been misused, it had also been the foundation for some of history's greatest acts of courage, sacrifice, and kindness. The abolition of slavery, the civil rights movement, hospitals, schools, and charities, all built by people who believed their faith called them to serve others. That couldn't be erased just because some had twisted faith for their own agendas. Alan sat back, studying her, momentarily without a response. Karoline seized the moment, leaning in slightly. If he truly wanted to understand why she defended
faith, it wasn't about history or politics. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. It was because of a woman she met 12 years ago. Alan's brow furrowed slightly. A woman? Karoline nodded, her voice softening.
Her name was Margaret, and she had taught Karoline something about faith that no debate could ever shake. The studio was silent. Alan, the audience, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. No one was prepared for the story she was about to tell. Karoline's hands rested on the table, fingers interlaced as she spoke, her voice quieter now, more deliberate. She recounted how, 12 years ago, fresh out of college, she had been working as a legislative assistant in Nashville. Politics consumed her world. Meetings, phone calls, drafting statements. She believed policy was the most powerful force in shaping lives. Then she met Margaret. Alan remained still, listening. The audience leaned in, drawn not by spectacle but by something deeper. Margaret was 72, and Karoline had met her at a community outreach event for seniors, one of those gatherings politicians attended for a quick photo op. But Karoline wasn't there for that. She had been doing her job, expected to take notes, listen, and leave. Yet Margaret had stopped her in her tracks. Karoline exhaled slightly, as if the memory itself carried weight. Margaret wasn't loud or demanding, yet when she spoke, people listened. She had a presence, one shaped by quiet strength, the kind that only came from enduring life's hardest battles and still standing. Karoline's voice carried the weight of Margaret's story, each word pulling the audience deeper into a place beyond politics and debate. Alan wasn't glancing at his notes anymore. He was listening. Margaret had buried 2 sons, one taken by cancer, the other by a drunk driver. She had lost her husband to a stroke. No siblings, no close family left. And yet, she had sat across from Karoline that day, smiling, sipping tea, asking about her life, as if the world hadn't stripped so much from her. Karoline's voice tightened for just a moment. She had asked Margaret how she did it, how she could endure so much loss and still remain warm and kind. Karoline turned her gaze to Alan now, not as an opponent, but simply as a person sharing something real. Margaret's response had stayed with her ever since. Faith, she had said, wasn't about proof. It was about what kept you standing when there was none. The room was silent. Even the hum of the cameras seemed to disappear. Margaret had told her that every morning, despite everything, she still woke up and thanked God. Karoline's voice was steady, But the emotion behind it was undeniable. Margaret hadn't thanked God because life had been easy. She hadn't done it because she was spared from suffering. She had done it because she was still here. Because even after everything, she believed there was still purpose in the days she had left. Karoline exhaled slowly. At 22, she had thought she understood strength, but Margaret had shown her what it truly looked like. That was when she realized faith wasn't just something people clung to in desperation. It was the very thing that kept them from breaking. She let the words settle, the weight of them hanging in the silence. Alan blinked, his lips parting slightly, as if he had something to say. But then, he shut his mouth again. The energy in the studio had shifted completely. The audience, normally quick to react, was utterly still. Even the host, usually eager to keep the momentum going, hesitated. Karoline didn't rush to fill the silence. She let it stretch, unafraid of its weight. Finally, Alan cleared his throat, shifting slightly in his chair. But whatever he had been about to say, it was clear. Something in him had changed. Karoline's voice remained steady as she met Alan's gaze. He admitted it was a powerful story, but questioned whether it was just that, a story. Margaret had found something that worked for her. But did that make faith a universal truth? Karoline nodded slightly, as if she had expected that response. Faith wasn't about proving something to others, it was about what people lived through. And if you truly listened, you'd hear that same story told a million different ways. Alan exhaled, rubbing the bridge of his nose. His issue wasn't just faith, it was that it wasn't measurable. It was built on emotions, experiences, things that couldn't be quantified. Yet people used it to justify decisions that impacted everyone. Karoline tilted her head slightly. You mean like hope? Alan blinked. Hope. It wasn't measurable, wasn't scientific. No one could prove it existed in a tangible way, yet people fought wars for it. They survived the impossible because of it. They held on to it, even when logic told them not to. She let the words settle before continuing. Would he tell someone who had lost their home in a tornado that their hope was just an emotional crutch? That their belief in something better wasn't real because it couldn't be put under a microscope? Alan shifted again, but didn't interrupt. Because that was the thing about faith. It existed not because it could be measured, but because, for so many, it was the only thing that kept them moving forward. Karoline's voice remained steady as she spoke. Faith wasn't about control. It wasn't about forcing belief onto anyone. It was about how people made sense of life's hardest moments. You could call it irrational, but when someone lost everything and still found the strength to get up the next day, there was something in that. Something that couldn't be measured, but also couldn't be ignored. Alan's fingers tapped lightly against the desk. His sharpness had softened. He wasn't just debating anymore, he was thinking. The host, sensing the shift, finally interjected. Alan, do you have a response to that? Alan opened his mouth, then closed it. He glanced toward the audience, searching for some kind of reaction to ground himself, but no one spoke. No one moved. When he finally answered, his voice lacked its earlier edge. I think I need to process that. A murmur rippled through the audience. It wasn't the dramatic rebuttal they had expected. It wasn't an explosive takedown or a definitive win. It was something far more rare, a moment of honesty. But the real reaction, the one that would send shockwaves across the country, was still to come. The debate wrapped up moments later, but the conversation was far from over. The usual applause that followed closing statements felt hesitant, as if the audience wasn't sure how to react. People weren't just reacting, they were reflecting. This wasn't the usual online outrage or political bickering. It was something deeper. Karoline scrolled through the messages, seeing words she hadn't expected. I never thought about faith this way. She didn't try to prove anything, she just spoke from the heart. Even those who had built careers on opposing her were hesitating, unsure of how to counter something that wasn't an argument, but a perspective. Alan had left the studio without a word, but his silence spoke volumes. He hadn't dismissed her outright. He had listened, and maybe, just maybe, he had walked away with something to think about. Karoline exhaled, setting her phone down. She knew this moment wouldn't last forever. The world would move on, the cycle of debates and division would continue. But for now, something had shifted, and in a conversation where neither side had claimed victory, faith had done something unexpected. It had made people pause. Deeper, something people had avoided discussing for too long. Faith, not as a political tool, not as a dividing line, but as a human experience. News segments dissected the exchange. Podcasts debated its meaning. And everyday people found themselves asking questions they hadn't considered before. Karoline received messages from unexpected voices. Atheists who admitted they respected her perspective. Skeptics who found themselves reconsidering, even long-time believers who felt renewed in their convictions. And then, something even more surprising happened. A week later, Alan Brooks appeared on his own network, not with a rebuttal, but with a reflection. I've spent my career challenging ideas, pushing people to defend what they believe. But, maybe sometimes, the most important thing isn't to argue, it's to listen. His words weren't a concession, but they weren't a dismissal either. They were an acknowledgement that the conversation wasn't over. Karoline had gone into that debate expecting resistance. Instead, she had sparked something rare, an honest conversation about faith in a world that had almost forgotten how to have one, who had offered them comfort when no one else could. The movement wasn't loud, it wasn't organized, it was something more organic, more personal. People weren't being told what to believe, they were simply remembering why belief had ever mattered to them in the first place. Karoline hadn't set out to start a movement, but that's exactly what was happening. Churches reported an increase in attendance, not because of doctrine, but because people wanted to feel connected again. Support. Groups and community gatherings saw a rise in participation. Even in secular spaces, the conversation about faith and meaning continued, and through it all, Karoline remained the same. She didn't capitalize on the moment or turn it into a campaign slogan. Instead, she did what she had always done. She listened. Because for the first time in a long time, people weren't just arguing. They weren't just shouting over each other in the endless cycle of political debates. They were pausing, they were thinking, and most importantly, they were talking. They come from the moments that catch us off guard, the ones that make us pause and reconsider what we thought we knew. Karoline didn't need to prove anything that night. She didn't need to convince Alan or anyone else to believe. All she did was open a door that had been shut for so long by skepticism, by fear, by the assumption that faith and reason couldn't exist in the same space. And yet, here they were. In the weeks that followed, the noise of politics resumed, the news cycle moved on, and the world continued its restless pace. But for those who had listened that night, something had shifted. It wasn't about sides or labels anymore. It was about the quiet, persistent voice inside every person, the one that longed for something more. Maybe faith wasn't about certainty. Maybe it wasn't about proof. Maybe, just maybe, it was about having the courage to believe in something even when the world told you not to.